There is a certain kind of silence that settles over a close-knit neighborhood just before the sun reaches its peak. It is a heavy, suffocating stillness. You can almost feel the heat radiating from the paved streets, pressing down on the roofs of houses that sit so close together you could reach out a window and touch your neighbor's wall. In these interwoven communities, life is not lived in private. It is shared across property lines, whispered over low fences, and watched by 100 pairs of eyes behind thin curtains. Community is everything. The bonds of proximity supposed to be your greatest comfort. But there is a dark side to that closeness. When everyone knows your name, your routines, and your secrets, the community ceases to be a safety net. It becomes a cage. In these streets, the air is thick with expectations. Tradition dictates the rhythm of life. You are born, you grow, you marry, you have children, and you age with respect. It is a worn, paved path that everyone is expected to walk. And God help the soul who strays from it. Parlandungan Siregar had strayed from that path. At 45 years old, he reached an age where a man is expected to be surrounded by the fruits of his life's labor. He should have had a wife bustling about the kitchen, children laughing in the courtyard, and the undeniable dignity of a patriarch in the making. Instead, his home was silent. He lived his life in the hollow echoes of an empty house. For a man of his age in this society, being unmarried was not just a personal circumstance. It was an anomaly. It was a glitch in the natural order, a persistent irregularity drawing the eyes of the village like a magnet. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that your very existence defies the unwritten laws of your community. Everywhere he went, Parlandungan carried the invisible weight of his solitary status. It was woven into his posture, etched into the lines of his face, and ever present in the quiet, subdued way he navigated the narrow streets of his own hometown. He was a quiet man who perhaps just wanted to be left alone to live out his days in peace. But peace is a luxury you cannot afford when your life is an open book for neighbors to critique. Every glance held a question. Every polite nod carried a silent judgment. The air he breathed was thick with the unspoken pity and condescension of those who had followed the rules. Parlandungan knew what they thought. You do not live in a place like that for decades without developing a sixth sense for the whispers trailing behind you. He felt their eyes burning into his back walking to the market. He felt the lingering stares sitting alone on his porch. The most dangerous thing about a cage is not the bars themselves, but the slow, creeping madness that infects the mind of the creature trapped inside. Year by year, the isolation curdles into something sour. His quiet endurance morphed into a simmering, invisible pressure seeking release. Parlandungan was a pot left on a low flame, growing hotter with every passing hour. He did not know it yet, but he was reaching his boiling point. All it would take was one persistent voice to shatter his fragile sanity and turn this quiet street into a landscape of unimaginable horror. Every village, every street, has its self-appointed king. A patriarch whose authority is not written in any law book, but is etched into the very fabric of the neighborhood through years of status and perceived superiority. In this particular stretch of houses, that man was Ashjim Irianto. At 60 years old, Ashjim had achieved everything a man in his society was supposed to achieve. He was a retired civil servant. In Indonesia, as in many parts of the world, a government job is the ultimate symbol of stability, respectability, and prestige. It meant a guaranteed pension, a life lived by the rules, and a position of quiet power. For decades, Ashjam had existed in a world where his word carried weight. When he sat behind a desk, people waited for his approval. When he spoke, people listened. Retirement did not extinguish that sense of authority. It merely transferred it from the office to the street where he lived. Ashjam Irianto was a man who felt deeply comfortable in his own skin. He had played the game of life exactly as it was meant to be played. He had the family, the career, the retirement, and the unwavering belief that his way was the right way. And with that belief came a dangerous sense of entitlement. Men like Ashjam do not believe in boundaries, especially not when dealing with those they consider beneath them in the social hierarchy. He saw the neighborhood as his domain, a place where he had earned the right to observe, comment, and question. He did not view his intrusion into other people's lives as nosiness or cruelty. In his mind, he was simply an elder taking an active interest, maintaining the proper order of things. If something was out of place, it was his prerogative, even his duty, to point it out and demand an explanation. And living right next door was the most glaring irregularity of all. The proximity of their lives was the fatal catalyst. They were not separated by miles or thick concrete walls, but by the thin, permeable boundaries of neighboring plots. Ashjam could see Parlandungan coming and going. He could hear the unnatural quiet of his solitary home. For a man accustomed to the bustling, successful rhythm of a traditional family life, the silence next door was practically offensive. It was an itch he felt compelled to scratch. Ashjam looked at the 45-year-old bachelor and did not see a man who wished to be left alone. He saw a failure to launch, a stubborn refusal to conform to the very societal rules that had rewarded Ashjam so handsomely. To Ashjam, Parlandungan was a puzzle that needed solving, or perhaps just a target for the idle hours of retirement. He possessed the careless cruelty of a man who has never had to question his own worth, interacting with a man whose self-worth was eroding by the day. Ashjam felt he had the right to ask anything, at any time, simply because he was older, more successful, and married. He did not realize that the authority he wore like a comfortable old coat was suffocating the man next door. He did not know that every time he opened his mouth to assert his dominance through a casually invasive question, he was not cementing his status as the wise village elder. He was unwittingly playing with the rusted latch of a cage holding back a dark, violent desperation. It never begins with a shout or a raised fist. The most profound psychological fractures usually start with something so mundane, so seemingly innocent, that the victim doesn't even realize the ground is shifting beneath their feet. It was just another humid afternoon, the kind where the tropical sun beats down relentlessly, baking the dust on the road and forcing everyone into the lethargic rhythm of survival. Parlandungan was likely just tending to his modest yard, sweeping away fallen leaves, minding his own business as he always did. The low wall separating his property from Ashjam Irianto's was supposed to be a boundary, but to the retired civil servant, it was merely a convenient leaning post. Ashjam stood there, arms resting comfortably on the concrete, radiating the casual confidence of a man who feels entirely entitled to your time. The conversation would have started with the usual pleasantries. A comment on the sweltering heat, a polite nod from Parlandungan, offering the deference expected of a younger man to a retired, respected elder. It was the standard script of neighborhood existence. But then came the pivot. There is a specific kind of silence that falls right before a boundary is crossed. Ashjam looked at the younger man, his eyes tracing the solitary figure, the empty porch behind him, the distinct lack of a family's chaotic presence. He leaned in just a fraction closer. The tone of his voice was likely conversational, perhaps even disguised as avuncular concern, but the words carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "You are getting older, Parlin Dungan," Ashton might have noted, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "A man your age should have a household to run, a wife to cook your meals, children to carry your name. Why are you still sitting in that house alone? Tell me, why aren't you married yet?" For a fraction of a second, the world stopped spinning. It was a deeply personal, incredibly invasive probe delivered with the casualness of asking for the time. Parlin Dungan felt a cold spike of humiliation pierce his chest. It was the first prick of a needle that would soon be driven deep into his psyche. The blood rushed to his ears, a hot flush of embarrassment crawling up his neck. He was trapped. To snap back would be an unforgivable breach of respect toward an elder, a social sin that would turn the entire street against him. So he swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He forced his facial muscles to contort into a tight, unnatural smile. He likely muttered a polite, evasive excuse, perhaps a nervous laugh, a vague mention of fate or not finding the right woman. It was a pathetic defense, a shield made of paper held up against a man holding a torch. Ashjam likely chuckled, satisfied with having imparted his elder wisdom, oblivious to the internal earthquake he had just triggered. He turned and walked back into his bustling, complete home, leaving Parlin Dungan standing paralyzed in the dust. But the air between the two houses had permanently changed. As Parlin Dungan retreated into the oppressive quiet of his own empty living room, the question did not stay outside. It followed him in. It echoed off the bare walls. "Why aren't you married yet?" It wasn't just a question. It was an indictment of his manhood, his worth, and his very existence in the eyes of his peers. That single, patronizing inquiry planted a dark, twisted seed in the fertile soil of his profound isolation. The quiet, agonizing torment of Parlin Dungan Saregar had officially begun, and the invisible clock counting down to tragedy had just started its fatal ticking. The first time a man is cut, it is a shock. He bleeds, he bandages the wound, and he tries to move on. But what happens when the exact same blade finds the exact same scar, day after day, week after week? The wound never closes. It festers. It becomes infected with a deep, consuming rot. This was the reality Parlin Dungan Saregar woke up to every single morning. Ashjam Irianto had discovered a bruised nerve, and for reasons known only to his own arrogant sense of superiority, he simply could not stop pressing on it. The initial question, "Why aren't you married?" did not fade into the background of neighborhood gossip. Instead, it became Ashjam's favorite greeting, a twisted catchphrase delivered with a smile that felt increasingly like a bared teeth snarl to the man forced to endure it. Imagine the suffocating dread of stepping out of your own front door. For most people, a home is a sanctuary, a place to shed the armor of the outside world. But for Parlin Dungan, the boundary of his property was the front line of a psychological war he was losing terribly. If he went out to fetch water, Ashton was there. If he sat on his porch to catch the evening breeze, Ashton's voice would drift over the low wall, carrying that same poison disguised as elder concern. "Still cooking for one, Parlin Dungan? When will you bring a woman to this house?" The repetition was a form of water torture, a relentless dripping that slowly hollowed out his mind. It was not just the words, it was the audience. In a village where houses breathe down each other's necks, private conversations do not exist. Every time Ashjam raised his voice to deliver his mocking inquiry, the neighbors heard. Parlandungan began to see the pity and amusement reflecting in the eyes of everyone he passed. The women buying vegetables at the morning market seemed to whisper behind their hands when he approached. The younger men, who should have been his peers, looked at him with a mixture of confusion and disrespect. He was becoming a caricature, the pathetic local bachelor, a cautionary tale for parents to frighten their sons into early marriages. And the architect of this humiliating public persona lived right next door, sleeping soundly just yards away. The tension between the two properties grew so thick you could carve it with a butcher's knife. Parlandungan stopped making eye contact. His polite nods turned into rigid, trembling jaws. He began to map his entire life around avoiding Ashjam, calculating his movements to ensure he would not cross paths with the retired civil servant. But you cannot outrun a ghost that lives in your own shadow. He was trapped in an echo chamber of judgment, where the walls threw Ashjam's mocking voice back at him no matter where he hid. The humiliation began to curdle into something far more dangerous than sadness. It became a living, breathing rage. A dark, ugly creature curled up in the pit of his stomach, feeding on every slight, every chuckle, every condescending piece of advice about finding a wife. Parlandungan was losing his grip on the quiet, submissive identity he had maintained for 45 years. The village thought they were watching a lonely man gently age into obscurity. They had no idea they were actually watching a highly explosive bomb being carefully, meticulously armed by the very man who considered himself the neighborhood's moral compass. You see, a man does not shatter another man's skull over a single sentence, no matter how cruel it might be. The human mind is resilient, absorbing a tremendous amount of casual abuse before it fractures. When a dam breaks, sweeping away everything in its path, you do not blame the final drop of rain. You look at the cracks spreading across the concrete for years. And between the homes of Parlandungan Siregar and Ashjam Irianto, the concrete had been crumbling for a very long time. The local police, when sifting through the wreckage of this street's shattered piece, would discover a chilling truth the neighborhood had politely ignored. This fatal explosion was not an isolated incident. The mocking question about marriage was simply the match dropped into a basement slowly filling with gasoline. For years, a silent, venomous war of attrition had been fought across their shared property line. It is the agonizing reality of suburban claustrophobia. When you despise the man living next door, you do not get to escape him. His existence becomes a constant, grating soundtrack to your own life. Parlandungan could hear the heavy, authoritative thud of Ashjam's footsteps pacing through his house. He could hear the booming, self-important laughter of a retired civil servant holding court. Every sound was a reminder of the man who looked down upon him. It was the petty, territorial disputes that fester in tight-knit communities. The sweepings of dried dirt pushed an inch too far across the boundary. The unspoken competitions of pride that Ashjam always won, leveraging his social standing to crush any quiet protests from the unmarried man next door. Parlandungan had spent years swallowing his pride, retreating into the shadows of his empty house, while Ashjam expanded his presence, suffocating his neighbor with his unapologetic existence. Every minor slight, every condescending look over the fence, every time Ashjam had used his title to assert his dominance, it all gathered in the dark corners of Parlandungan's mind. He was a man slowly, methodically stripped of his dignity. The village saw a quiet bachelor, but beneath that placid exterior, a vast reservoir of pure, unadulterated hatred had been accumulating. Ashjam had spent years building a tower of arrogant offenses, perfectly unaware he was constructing it on top of a volatile fault line. He viewed Parlandungan not as a threat, but as a permanent fixture of his own superiority, a stepping stone to tread upon. But hatred is a living, breathing thing. It requires space to grow, and in the cramped quarters of their adjoining lives, Parlandungan's hatred had run out of room. The constant interrogation about why he was not married was no longer just an insult. It was the final twist of the knife in a wound festering for years. It was the ultimate declaration of Ashjam's victory and Parlandungan's absolute failure in the eyes of the world. The history of their bad blood had solidified into a heavy, suffocating anvil pressing down on his chest. He could no longer breathe without tasting the bitter ash of his own resentment. The tension had stretched until it was microscopic, humming with a lethal vibration. The foundation was set, the hatred was perfectly primed, and the only thing left was for the sun to rise on the day the devil finally decided to walk the streets of their quiet village. The sun did not rise with any particular malice on the morning of July 29th, but the light that crept through the cracks in Parlandungan Saregar's window fell upon a man who was profoundly, irreparably changed. There is a common misconception about the moment a human mind finally snaps. People expect a cinematic explosion of rage, a screaming fit, or a sudden, frantic tearing at the walls. But true psychological fractures are often entirely silent. They happen in the dead, quiet spaces of the night, in the breathless moments between sleep and waking. When Parlandungan opened his eyes that morning, the oppressive, suffocating weight that had crushed his chest for years was inexplicably gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow expanse of absolute certainty. The frantic, anxious energy of a man desperately trying to avoid humiliation had evaporated. He was no longer the frightened creature pacing the floor of his cage. He had become something else entirely. He lay there in the stifling morning heat, listening to the familiar, chaotic sounds of the village coming to life around him, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt a chilling sense of control. He rose from his bed, his movements slow, deliberate, and stripped of their usual nervous hesitation. As he walked through his empty house, the silence that had once mocked him now felt like a deep, holding breath. He did not look at the empty chairs or the unlit stove with sorrow. The shame that Ashjam Irianto had so meticulously carved into his soul had burned away, leaving nothing behind but cold, hardened ash. Parlandungan knew, with the terrifying clarity of the doomed, exactly what the day held. If he stepped outside, if he simply existed in the space adjacent to his neighbor, the voice would come. The retired civil servant would lean over the boundary, wearing that same patronizing, self-satisfied smile, and he would deliver the verbal poison. He would ask the question. He would demand to know why Parlandungan was a failure, why he was alone, why he was not a real man. It was as inevitable as the rising tide. Ashjam could no more stop himself from asserting his dominance than he could stop breathing. But today, the script was going to change. Parlandungan stood in his dim kitchen, the tropical heat already pressing against the thin walls of his home, and he made a decision that severed his ties to humanity. He decided that he was never going to hear that question again. Not today. Not tomorrow. Never. The sheer finality of that thought washed over him like a baptism of ice water. It is a profoundly dangerous thing when a cornered man stops looking for a way out and starts looking for a way through. He didn't feel anger in that moment. Anger is hot, unpredictable, and messy. What he felt was necessity. It was a dark, logistical problem that required an immediate, permanent solution. Ashjam's voice was the disease, and Parlin Dungan, in his fractured, isolated reality, had just become the surgeon. He moved to the window and peered through the thin fabric of the curtain, his eyes locking onto the property next door, the house of the patriarch, the source of his unending torment. He watched the subtle movements of life stirring within Ashjam's domain, tracking them with the cold, detached focus of a predator watching its prey. The agonizing years of bowing his head, of swallowing his pride, of shrinking himself down to make room for his neighbor's monstrous ego, it was all over. The invisible tether of societal expectation that had bound his hands for 45 years simply dissolved. He turned away from the window, his face a completely blank slate, devoid of any empathy, hesitation, or fear. He did not need to scream. He did not need to argue. He only needed to find something solid, something heavy, and something capable of silencing the village's most respected voice once and for all. When a man resolves to commit an act of irreversible violence, the world around him undergoes a strange and terrifying transformation. Objects lose their everyday purpose and suddenly become instruments of a singular, horrifying will. Parlin Dungan did not frantically tear through his home looking for a weapon. There was no desperate rummaging, no panicked scattering of belongings, and no outward display of the madness consuming him. His movements were terrifyingly methodical, driven by the cold, calculating engine of a mind that had entirely detached from human consequence. He walked out into the stifling heat of his small yard, his eyes scanning the familiar, mundane clutter of his solitary existence. He bypassed the kitchen knives. Blades are intimate, messy, and require a certain kind of frantic, emotional passion he simply did not possess that morning. He needed something blunt, something incredibly heavy, something that carried the dense, unyielding weight of the 45 years of resentment he was about to unleash upon his neighbor. His gaze settled on a piece of wood resting in the dirt. It was entirely unremarkable, perhaps leftover from a forgotten repair or a discarded piece of heavy timber meant for a fire that was never lit. But in that moment, under the harsh glare of the July sun, it ceased to be a simple piece of scrap. As Parlin Dungan bent down and wrapped his fingers around the rough grain, it became the physical manifestation of his agony. He lifted it, testing its heft. It was substantial, solid enough to shatter the illusion of his neighbor's untouchable superiority. The coarse texture bit into his palms, grounding him, anchoring his fractured psyche to the horrifying reality of what he was about to do. He gripped it tighter, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. All the years of bowing his head, all the forced smiles, all the humiliating evasions, they flowed down his arms and solidified in the heavy timber he now held firmly at his side. He was no longer the pathetic, unmarried outcast of the village. He was the executioner, and he had finally found his gavel. The distance between his front door and the home of Ashjam Irianto was painfully short. It was a proximity that had tortured him for years, a suffocating closeness that had allowed his neighbor to casually lob insults over the property line without ever raising his voice. But on this morning, that agonizingly short distance worked in his favor. Dungan stepped off his property, his feet crunching softly against the dry, baked earth. Each step was a deliberate, irreversible crossing of a psychological Rubicon. The neighborhood was awake, the ambient noise of a village morning humming in the background, yet he moved through it like a ghost. No one noticed the quiet, broken man carrying a piece of wood. Why would they? He had spent a lifetime making himself entirely invisible, a survival skill that now served as his perfect, deadly camouflage. He approached the boundary of Ashjam's domain, the invisible line he had spent years terrified to cross. But today, there was absolutely no hesitation. The air around him seemed to grow thick, the very atmosphere straining under the weight of his impending act. He could hear the muffled sounds of life coming from within the house, perhaps the clatter of a morning routine or the heavy, confident footsteps of the retired civil servant moving about his kingdom, utterly oblivious to the walking nightmare standing just outside his door. Dungan stopped just short of the entrance. His chest rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic cadence. The deafening roar of his own heartbeat filled his ears, drowning out the distant chatter of the street and the buzzing of insects. He did not raise the piece of wood just yet. He simply stood there in the heavy, suffocating stillness of his own making, savoring the final, fleeting seconds of a world that was about to be violently, permanently torn apart. The fuse had burned all the way down to the powder. There is a profound, arrogant safety that comes with living a life completely unchecked. Ashjam Irianto existed in a bubble of his own making, a comfortable reality where he was the undisputed master of his environment. Inside the boundaries of his home, he was not just a retired government worker. He was a king moving through his castle. On this specific morning, he was likely going about the mundane rituals of his privileged existence. Perhaps he was sipping his morning coffee, the bitter aroma mixing with the heavy tropical humidity, or perhaps he was simply standing in his doorway, surveying the street he felt he owned. He did not lock his doors against men like Dungan Saregar. In Ashjam's mind, the quiet, unmarried neighbor was not a threat. He was a prop. He was a piece of the neighborhood scenery, placed there specifically to remind Ashjam of his own superior life choices. The concept of danger coming from the submissive, 45-year-old bachelor was so entirely foreign to his worldview that when Dungan finally stepped across the threshold, Ashjam's brain simply refused to register the hazard. When Ashjam's eyes finally landed on the intruder, there was no immediate alarm. The retired civil servant probably straightened his posture, pulling his shoulders back to project his usual, effortless authority. The familiar, patronizing smile would have instinctively crawled onto his lips. He saw Dungan, but he did not see the heavy, jagged piece of timber gripped tightly in the younger man's hand. He only saw his favorite target. You can almost imagine the intake of breath, the arrogant swelling of Ashjam's chest as he prepared to deliver his daily dose of poison. He likely opened his mouth, the words already forming on his tongue, ready to ask the fatal question one more time. "What are you doing here, Dungan? Have you finally found a woman willing to live in that empty house of yours?" But those words were never given the chance to fully materialize in the heavy morning air. Because for the first time in their entire, agonizing history as neighbors, Dungan did not wait for permission to exist. He did not shrink away, and he did not lower his eyes. He moved with a terrifying, silent fluidity. There was no battle cry, no scream of decades-long frustration, no frantic curse. There was only the sudden, violent displacement of air as the heavy piece of wood swung upward in a vicious, unbroken arc. The sheer, terrifying silence of the attack was worse than any roar. It was the absolute, mechanical efficiency of a man who had completely severed his connection to humanity and transformed into a blunt instrument of vengeance. The wood blurred as it tore through the space between them, carrying the dense, suffocating weight of every whispered insult, every mocking laugh, and every stolen shred of dignity. The impact was a sickening, unnatural sound that shattered the quiet rhythm of the entire neighborhood. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, arrogant reality being violently smashed into a million jagged pieces. The first blow caught the older man completely off guard. The shock that registered in Ashjim Irianto's eyes in that microsecond was not just physical pain. It was the absolute, terrifying collapse of his worldview. The man he had treated as a pathetic, helpless joke for years had just brought a weapon crashing down upon him. Ashjim stumbled backward, the patronizing smile wiped completely from his face, replaced by the stark, primal terror of a man who suddenly realizes he is no longer the predator. He was bleeding, disoriented, and staring into the dead, empty eyes of a neighbor who had come to collect a massive, bloody debt. The king had been struck, his crown knocked into the dust, and the true horror of the morning had only just begun. Survival is a base instinct, one that strips away decades of civilized conditioning in a fraction of a second. Ashjim Irianto, the proud, retired civil servant who had never run from anything in his comfortable life, was suddenly thrust into the primal role of prey. The first blow of the heavy timber had not killed him, but it had entirely shattered the illusion of his untouchable status. Pain, sharp and blinding, radiated through his skull, but it was eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated terror of the man standing before him. Parlandungan Siregar did not look like the quiet, submissive bachelor anymore. He was a force of nature, an avalanche of repressed rage finally unleashed. Ashjim didn't try to reason. He didn't try to use his booming voice of authority. The words of condescension died in his bleeding mouth. He turned, his aging legs scrambling for purchase on the smooth floor of his home, and he ran. He burst through his own doorway. The sanctuary he had ruled for years now a trap he desperately needed to escape. He spilled out onto the sun-baked pavement of the street, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate plea for salvation. Out in the open, the neighborhood was just beginning to stir, the morning routines violently interrupted by the sight of their respected elder, fleeing for his life. But Parlandungan did not care about the audience anymore. The invisible cage of societal judgment that had kept him paralyzed for 45 years was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying, narrow tunnel vision. His entire universe had shrunk down to the stumbling, bleeding figure of the man who had tormented him. He stepped out of Ashjim's house, the heavy piece of wood still gripped firmly in his hand, its rough surface now carrying the first dark stain of his vengeance. He did not sprint. He did not yell. The horrific reality of his pursuit was its relentless, measured pace. He moved with the chilling inevitability of a shadow stretching across the afternoon sun. He stalked after Ashjim, his eyes locked dead on the back of his tormentor's neck. The street, usually a place of community and shared lives, transformed into a gladiatorial arena. The neighbors who heard the commotion stepped out of their doors, the morning gossip freezing on their lips as they witnessed the impossible, the invisible man hunting down the village king. Ashjim's lungs burned, his 60-year-old body betraying him as he desperately tried to put distance between himself and the grim reaper trailing just behind him. He looked back, perhaps hoping to see Parlin Dungan exhausted, perhaps hoping the momentary burst of violence had passed. But the quiet neighbor was right there, his face an emotionless mask of cold, hard resolve. The gap was closing. Ashjam stumbled, his feet tangling as panic overrode his coordination. He reached out, perhaps grabbing for a fence, a wall, anything to pull himself forward, but the air was empty. He was out of time, out of breath, and out of the arrogant luck that had defined his existence. Parlin Dungan caught up to him right there in the middle of the public street, in full view of the world that had mocked him. He raised the heavy timber high into the thick morning air. All the questions, all the snide remarks about a wife, all the humiliating smirks and condescending advice, they all culminated in this single, downward arc. The piece of wood came down with a sickening, definitive force, striking Ashjam Irianto squarely on the head. It was a fatal, cataclysmic blow that stopped the desperate flight instantly. The retired civil servant crumpled to the unforgiving pavement like a puppet with its strings violently severed, the street swallowing the sudden, heavy thud of his body. The hunt was over, and the suffocating neighborhood returned to a breathless standstill. The echo of that sickening thud hung in the humid morning air long after the heavy timber finally came to rest. For a solitary, agonizing second, the entire street was paralyzed. The women who had been sweeping their porches, the men preparing for their daily labor, they all stood frozen, their eyes wide, trying to comprehend the impossible brutality that had just erupted on their quiet pavement. Then, the spell shattered. A collective, terrified scream ripped through the neighborhood. Chaos exploded as residents surged forward from their homes, an ocean of panicked voices and desperate, frantic motion. They swarmed the fallen patriarch, their hands desperately pressing against the horrific wound, trying to hold back the life that was spilling out onto the unforgiving asphalt. And in the very center of this frantic, screaming whirlwind stood Parlin Dungan Saregar. He did not run. He did not attempt to swing his makeshift weapon at the neighbors rushing past him. The terrifying, consuming rage that had fueled his pursuit had instantly evaporated the moment the final blow connected. The heavy piece of wood slipped from his bloodless fingers, clattering uselessly to the ground. He simply stood there, an empty vessel, his chest heaving, staring down at the broken, bleeding body of the man who had tormented him for years. The storm inside him was finally, permanently quiet. The neighbors hauled Ashjam Irianto's limp body from the dust, the man who was once the undisputed king of their street, now reduced to a fragile, dying victim. They loaded him into a waiting vehicle, the doors slamming shut as they began a desperate, reckless race toward the nearest hospital. The engine roared, tires squealing against the pavement, but it was a race they were destined to lose before it even began. The damage inflicted by decades of simmering hatred, concentrated into one fatal strike, was simply too catastrophic. Somewhere along that frantic journey, amidst the agonizing bumps of the road and the desperate pleas of his neighbors, Ashjam Irianto exhaled for the very last time. The booming, authoritative voice that had demanded answers, that had relentlessly questioned a man's worth and mocked his solitary existence, was permanently silenced. He died before he ever reached the sterile, white halls of the hospital, leaving behind a legacy that had been entirely undone by a single, catastrophic miscalculation of human endurance. Back on the street, The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers soon painted the neighborhood in a harsh, unforgiving glare. They found Parlandungan Siregar exactly where the violence had ended, waiting for them. He was arrested shortly after the assault, offering absolutely no resistance as the cold, metal handcuffs were clamped around his wrists. He did not look like a monster. He merely looked like a tired, broken man who had finally finished a terrible, unavoidable chore. He was led away from the street he had called home, leaving behind a community that would be forever scarred by his breaking point. The police would later confirm what the street already whispered. This fatal attack was not an isolated burst of madness, but the terrifying culmination of a long, dark history of escalating tensions. The neighborhood was forced to reckon with the horrifying truth that they had watched the pressure building for years, masking their neighbors' slow psychological collapse as idle gossip. Now 2 houses sit entirely empty, side by side. One belongs to a man buried in the ground, and the other to a man rotting in a concrete cell. And the space between them is filled with nothing but a heavy, suffocating silence, a chilling, permanent reminder of the deadly cost of asking the wrong question to a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose.